Well, I hope that opening sequence, what your appetite for what we're going to be dealing with these next 2 or 3 episodes, maybe more, 4 or 5 maybe. I have to apologize first. It's been a long time since I've posted an episode, and folks have been asking me a lot when the next one was going to come. And I've been a number of things going on. I had been working on the railroad, but I've been very busy with some of my volunteer work and resettling Afghan refugees. I'm happy to report that our church, in partnership with 4 other churches, has resettled 25, 26 families, about 130 adults and children, and they're all doing very well. And Kathy's been very involved in teaching English as a second language to refugees. And then also I've been working on climate change, and in that respect, in a few episodes I'll have another little surprise for you. I'll just keep you in suspense about that. But these episodes are going to start the business of making the scenery, making the railroad look like a real geographical place. Now you can see here by what you saw in the opening segment and what you see next to me, I've done quite a lot. The last time you saw this, it was bare open bench work with sub-road bed and track and not much else. Well, there's scenery in here now. I've completed scenery on about 30 feet, linear feet of the layout, probably 25, 30 feet. And this area is meant to look like the hills of California, the Central Valley, the golden hills, the golden grass, and the distinctive black oak trees, live oak trees. And I'm going to be dealing with this in segments. This episode is going to be the first part of the building this scenery, which is going to deal with the backdrop. And that in itself was a major project, and it's just off to my right here. You'll see more of that when I talk about it. And then I'm going to move on to building the substructure for the scenery and adding the rock to the scenery to make the terrain, looking at terrain, little conversations about geomorphology, how landforms come to be formed. And this is really important because as a geographer I've been trained in landforms, geomorphology, and recognizing them, and so paying attention to these details is very important to me to really set the scene for Southern California. And I'll show some comparison photos of the real area I'm interested in and compare to the model, and I'm pretty happy with how it's come out. So we'll be talking about that, a little bit of geology lessons, and then also the track ballasting. And one of the things that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but a lot of model railroad experts will tell you, is that you have to, in part, consider track as part of the scenery. Yes, it's the track, and yes, you have to worry about the mechanical and electrical issues of getting the trains to run properly on the track. And that's very important because a railroad where you're constantly having problems with electrical and track issues about the trains not staying on the track, it ceases to be fun in a hurry. So that's the #1 priority. But once you get past that and get a good substructure for the track, and a good mechanical performance, then you have to devote attention to making the track look like it really fits where it is. And there are interesting things about weathering the track, weathering the sides of the rail, ballasting, touches in ballasting, weathering, all the details go along with that. And then there's also building vegetation. Now I've built somewhere near, I guess, 150 California live oak trees, and that in itself was an interesting adventure. And got into a little bit of botany because they are a very, very distinctive landform feature to Central California up into Southern Oregon. And they're known as the California live oaks. There's about 12 or 15 sub-varieties of them, but they're very distinctive, and they only grow in this part of the world. So they are the hallmark feature. When you look at the hills of California, you see the California live oaks, called black oaks or coastal oaks. They go by a bunch of different names. And that in itself was interesting. So there's the vegetation, and also putting the vegetation on the layout. As you can see here, there's scrub growing in the semi-arid soil. And this is a semi-arid virtual desert environment. So that results in some interesting kinds of vegetation. And then finally, another part of the scenery is the trains themselves. And as you noticed on the little segment at the start, some of the segments there, that the railroad equipment doesn't look nice and shiny the way you get model trains out of a box. This is weathering. This is to make them look like real railroad equipment. And if you've ever just stood by a grade crossing, stood by a railroad line and watched equipment go by, you notice a lot of it is pretty grungy. Okay, the railroads usually, once they get a new piece of equipment, they really don't put a whole lot of attention into washing and waxing it. I mean, yes, they do, they clean it up and repaint it when it comes in for periodic maintenance, but that might be over a period of 10 years. And in the interim, they get hit by taggers with graffiti, they get patches and replacements, they'll get areas where the metal is replaced and there'll be a newly painted area in the middle of a car that's not all that clean. The important thing, though, is they pay attention to the mechanical reliability of the car. That gets number one priority. So a car that is not mechanically able to perform its function is not making the railroad money. So while they don't pay a lot of attention to the cosmetics of the car, they pay an incredible amount of attention to the mechanics of the car. So all the equipment you'll see is made to look like well-maintained, heavily used, real railroad equipment. Now, those cars that you saw that were weathered in the opening segment were actually 57-foot mechanical refrigerator cars, and they were being spotted at a fruit terminal that I kit bashed from another Walthers kit and turned it into a fruit terminal from a transfer terminal, and which is a very distinctive feature of this part of California. And the railroad cars, the refrigerator cars, were being spotted for loading or taken away after they're loaded at the produce terminal. And they're cars that have an onboard diesel generator powered refrigeration unit. Virtually all of the produce that comes out of Southern California, which is the produce producing area for the entire United States, and the vast majority of it comes from Southern California, the Central Valley of California, comes out on rail cars. Rail cars like these 57-foot, 100-ton capacity refrigerator cars. And if you're eating a salad on the East Coast, more than likely the greens and the vegetables in that salad 4 days before left the Central Valley of California on one of these cars. So they're something that's very tied into our economy. As the commercial goes, freight rail works. So with that, I'm going to go on, and one other thing, I'm also going to talk about putting structures on the layout, because that's a large part of scenery, making the structures look like they were actually built there, as opposed to a model that somebody just sat on a board, and giving them a real presence, giving them a context, make them look like they are there because they belong there, because they're serving some function. So with that, we're going to get into the meat of episode 1. Well, with now episode 17, we're at another point of departure on the construction of the model railroad, turning point. As it brought it along to this point, the mainline track is all in, it's all wired, it's all operating, so I can run trains. And now I'm going to start on a new phase of the layout, and again, this will be one of these kinds of hopping from one kind of work to another, but we're going to hop now on, for a few episodes at least, onto the subject of scenery. And I've been really looking forward to doing this part, because I've been reading about scenery techniques for all the years I've been moving around and not having a permanent layout. So I've formed some very interesting ideas in my head about how I want to do it, and taking a lot of advice from a lot of the pros in the business, people like Pelle Seborg, who does beautiful modeling, looks almost like the real thing, far beyond anything I'm capable of doing. And what I want to adapt this to my model railroad. Now, to talk a minute about the scenery and the scenery I'm going to put in. I mentioned previously that some people build their model railroad and they want to model a real, actual railroad in a real location, okay, and they go to great lengths to find real-world track diagrams and model those locations with exact fidelity to scale. Some people on the other extreme want to do a fictitious railroad, railroad of their own design, their own creation, their own area, and so they'll let their imagination run about how they want to do it. Although it doesn't go to outlandish things, but it's in areas where might have been railroads, kind of thing. And then in the middle, there are people like me who want to capture a particular flavor about a railroad and will borrow from real world and fiction, for lack of a better term, to create a railroad that basically fulfills a nostalgia. And that's my point on this. I have been a fan of the Union Pacific for as long as I can remember, and that's my favorite railroad. And for many years, my my work required me to travel out to China Lake, California, to the Naval Weapons Center, and which was really fortunate because I was able to plug in on many of those trips a day of leave or on en route, where I could go to a very famous stretch of what was originally the Southern Pacific Railroad, now part of the Union Pacific, which was the line over the Tehachapi Mountains from Mojave, California to Bakersfield, California, which includes a very famous railroad feature, the Tehachapi Loop. I would like to have replicated the Tehachapi Loop on my layout, but that would consume a lot of space, so wasn't able to do that. But I spent many happy hours through a couple of decades here and there watching my favorite railroad climb and descend the Tehachapi Mountains and go through Tehachapi Loop. And because of that, I became very, very fascinated with the geography of that part of California. And I decided when I finally built my railroad, I wanted to capture the essence of the Union Pacific line through the Tehachapi Mountains and the town of Tehachapi and Mojave and various aspects of the route, and some other details not associated directly with that area. So my railroad is a semi-real world, semi-fictitious world creation. And again, it's my railroad, so I can do what I want with it. And that's part of the fun of this hobby. You can set out to do what you want to create, and that's your prerogative, and more power to you. And because of that, one of the things I really remember, and I remember this also because in 1975 I was going through missile operations training at Vandenberg Air Force Base, which is not that far over on the coast from this area. And at that time I became very fascinated with the geomorphology of California. This was in 1975, many years ago. And speaking as a geographer, let's talk for a minute about geomorphology. Geomorphology is the study of how landforms develop, the forces that make them, and how they weather and how they appear, and what you can tell about the structure of the earth under them. The western side of California, along the coast and inland to some extent, including the Tehachapi Mountains, is what we call a very tortured geomorphology. It's at the leading edge of the North American plate, which is subducting the Pacific Ocean plate. And you can think of a lot of the geologic features, a lot of the landform features in the western half side of California, almost as being the result of, for lack of a better expression, the earth that piles up in front of a bulldozer blade as it moves forward, if that blade is angled. And you get a lot of very jumbled, a lot of tortured geography and landforms, but you get a lot of very picturesque landforms. And California is known for the Golden Hills, which is one of the features I really wanted to create, the Golden Hills caused by the pampas grass, or the prairie grass that grows on them, and which actually goes into drought most of the year and turns gold. These hills are green, but for a brief period in the early spring, and then they go gold. And this originally resulted in California being known as the Golden State. So it's a very, very symbolic landform. And I wanted to capture these Golden Hills, as I said, because I spent many hours watching the Union Pacific trains go through the Golden Hills of California. So because of that, there's a portion of my layout which runs for about 24 or 30 feet, which is going to replicate Union Pacific trains running through the Golden Hills between Tehachapi and Bakersfield. And to do this, I've employed some techniques I've read about, developed a few of my own, and I've kind of got this thing down to the way I want to do it. And what you're seeing right here is part of the backdrop. And because these hills are in successions, when you look at the Golden Hills of California, you see rows upon rows of hills going back. I decided I wanted to try experimenting with constructing a low-relief 3D backdrop instead of a photo backdrop. So what you see that I've constructed here are supposed to represent the hills that are further back from the viewer. And I'm using a technique called forced perspective. And I'll explain how that works in these coming graphics and discussion. And what you are seeing are the hills that are further beyond the foreground depicted here. And one of the distinctive features of the Golden Hills of California, and I'm going to refer to some graphics, I've got a lot of graphics to put up on the screen here. These first couple of graphics show the Golden Hills. You can see the landform color of the grass, the golden effect, the golden brown effect. Sometimes it goes to a very bright gold, as is in the second graphic. But one of the other distinctive features is the California black oak tree. And this is in the graphic I'm showing here. The California black oak is a live oak. It doesn't drop its leaves. It's a very hardy oak, but it's very particular to this area. And as you see from the other pictures that I showed previously, the black oak, like all trees, would tend to grow and develop in areas where there's more running water. So the black oak very much traces ridge lines and drainage paths through these hills, and it has a very distinctive cast to the hills, a very distinctive appearance. And you can see the leaves in the next graphic have this olive green kind of look. They're very waxy, like a lot of oak leaves. They're very tough. They don't break down very readily, and they have this olive cast to them. And the black oak trees themselves in these next couple graphics have a very distinctive form, a very distinctive branch architecture, if you will, and then shows these silhouette scenes at sunset show a lot of this structure. Well, in a following episode, I'm going to be actually making, I bought some black oak tree models, but I'm going to be making black oak trees. And that's going to be kind of interesting because I've never done that kind of thing before. I've got a lot of how-to, and I've been digesting a lot of ideas and kind of coming up with some of my own twists on it. And we'll see how successful I can be at carrying off a black oak tree. But I want to have them on the layout because they are a signature feature, along with the golden grass of this part of California. And getting back to the backdrop that I've made so far, the focus of this episode, as I said, I'm using excuse me, a forced perspective technique, and that what you're seeing here represent the very distant hills, and you can see that I've used very, very finely ground foam, an olive green foam from Woodland Scenics, to simulate these trees. And you can see by the patterns of the trees, they replicate this following of ridge lines, following of drainage courses, and as you get in the higher elevations in the hills, you get more coverage of the trees. The environment is more hospitable to their growth, and they cover more of the higher elevations and tops of hills. So these will be the background, and you will glimpse these behind the foreground scenery. Well, the foreground scenery is going to be a part of the following episode, so I'll get to that later. So I'm concentrating on the background here. So how did I make this three-dimensional low-relief background? Well, I started with 1/4 inch XPS foam. Remember, good old extruded polystyrene, not expanded polystyrene. And I found this in fan fold sections at my local Home Depot, and I cut it in strips, and I built up 2 successive layers. It's like we're having some rain outside. You may hear it in the background. I built up 2 successive layers of background, three-dimensional background. Well, how did I do that? Well, to go through these following graphics, and there's going to be a lot of them here, I started off by cutting strips of the foam. You can see my carpenter square and my utility knife there to cut out the strips. And the first thing I did was take 1 layer of strips and clip it up to the sky backboard of my backdrop. Essentially, I did this to establish the curvature because these are going to have to be curved sections. And as I went on, I cut strips and laminated them using a special adhesive for foam board, and you can buy foam board adhesive at Home Depot. It's in their basic tube things, but you got to be sure that it's suitable for foam board because a lot of products like liquid nails contain solvents that will just dissolve foam board, and you don't want to do that. So they make adhesive specifically for foam board, and it will say on the label if it's suitable for foam board. And what I did is I built up layers, 4 layers, doing successively, each one at a time, and essentially I made a curved, essentially foam plywood shape. Because each layer I glued on would further reinforce the curvature of the shape, so I knew that when I eventually took it off, because I'd have to work on it, that it had the correct amount of curvature. And then on that first course of laminated foam, I painted it with a coat of latex-based Kills, no problem, and then traced onto it a gridded square system. And you can see in this graphic there's a gridded square, And this gridded square is scaled from a panoramic view I had of the California hills. Now you'll notice the grid on the panoramic view is much smaller than that on the foam board, and that's deliberate because I had the mosaic image I had was about not quite half as long as the area I wanted to cover, so I had to expand the grid on the foam board I put on the wall or in the backdrop. And this allowed me to, just by freehand, translate where the lines of the hills intersected the grid and transfer that freehand onto the graphic here. Again, it's not exact, but I wanted to get the flavor of the hills. The next thing I had to do, once I did this, was to build the second layer of hills, the closer range of hills, and I did that by putting in the spacers that you see as this next diagram, or this next graphic, the spacers, and then I did the same technique with 4 successive layers of 1/4 inch foam to build up another curved section. And you can see in this next graphic that I've taken a Sharpie and outlined the dominant highest point of the hills on the rear portion of laminated foam, and then transferred a grid onto the second, the closer 4 layers of foam. And I did this because once I unclipped these and took them down, they weren't permanently mounted up, I unclipped them and took them down, I went out into the garage, and since they were a convenient length, I could just carry them upstairs, and they were already glued together so they would stay at the degree of curvature I wanted. I used my hot wire foam cutter, to cut out the profile of the hills. And I did the same thing on the back portion, so I have 2 successive layers here. The next thing I did is I went along the sky backdrop and put in spacer blocks to have the rear layer of hills stand out a small distance from the sky to give this illusion of depth, to give it being ahead of, closer than the sky. Okay? And having done that, I then glued the rear layer, the 4-ply layer, the most background, for lack of a better term, hills, these hills here, onto the spacer squares. And once that was done, I then applied, as you can see in this next graphic, spacers for the foreground hills. And I went ahead and then did the same thing with the foreground hills and glued them up. And once that was done, switching pages here, once that was done, I went through and carved all the shapes within the hills. Now this is where it gets interesting. Again, I had done the overall profile using the hot wire cutters, but that was out in the garage, and these were easy to transport. I really didn't want to use the hot wire cutters in the house because this is polystyrene, and when you heat it up, it does release some noxious odors, and didn't want to have that drifting through the house. So how I did the shapes, the rounding and the smoothing and adding additional contours and this kind of thing was a whole succession of tools. Used a utility knife, a Surform cutter, a larger Surform cutter, a really large Surform cutter, an inexpensive steak knife that I bought through Amazon, $2.50, and a small paring knife. And you use these in combination, just whatever works at whatever point where you're using the cut and profile of the styrofoam, and or not styrofoam, the expanded polystyrene. And once that was done, I would sand it smooth with the sanding blocks that are available online that are used for sanding drywall. They come in various degrees of grit. They work great for smoothing and sanding this stuff. And this is I think is a 60 grit, which is the coarsest. And they're nice because they are foam, but they're rigid. They give you a way to control the shape. They're handy for shaping this stuff. And I got to tell you, you're going to make a lot of dust doing this. A lot of styrofoam bits and crud. It's good to have your shop vac and a portable vac and whatever kind of vacs you have down here or down in your area to do this, because it's going to get messy. And fortunately, with a good vac, you can clean up stuff, and that works well. So once that was all smooth and shaped, then I needed to surface coat it, the expanded polystyrene, the extruded polystyrene, with some kind of surface coating to give a smooth texture. And I found, looking at some suggestions in Model Railroader, Homax's Home Texture Paint. And you can see the graphic here. It shows the Homax paint available at Amazon again. 20, like $29 for a 2-gallon bucket of the stuff. And you can see in this next graphic where it's popped open, it's latex paint, but it's really, really thick latex paint. It's latex paint that's used to put texture on a wall. It's about the consistency of just mixed plaster. And I applied this to the foam to give a base, to give something to work on top. I actually did 2 applications. You can put it on up to an eighth of an inch thick. I used a 4-inch paint roller or a 3 or 4 inch good paintbrush, exploded tip paintbrush. Worked fine, dried easily within 24 hours, and it gave me a base to work with. And then this next graphic shows some containers of foliage and grass, static grass, which I'll talk more about in another episode, which I'm going to use to replicate the very close-up California golden grass. But these are distant hills, so basically I wanted to match the color. Luckily, the local local True Value hardware store was changing ownership and becoming an Ace hardware store, and they had a lot of True Value paint, and they wanted to get rid of it, and they were selling it for 90% discount. So I tried it in there with my HO scale grass and got a couple gallons. I said, can you tint these to match these colors for me? And they said, sure. So basically I walked out of the store with $38 paint, and I think I paid less than $3 a gallon for it. So that's a pretty good deal, $3 a gallon. And the next slide shows how I painted the areas, the hills here, with an overall base coat to simulate the golden grass. Okay, now again, this is a base coat, but if you remember from the graphics, I'll throw them back up here in a second just so you can see, you know that the grass is a uniform color. Your eye tells you that when you get up close to it, but when you see it from a distance, you're going to see differences in shading and hue based on the angle the sun is hitting it, and shadows from the clouds and all kinds of stuff. So I needed to subtly tint various areas. You can see here, as you're looking at the graphic, you can see there are shadings and variations and stuff, and that's where my portable USB charged airbrushes that I got, I have 2 of them now, came in very handy. Now, word of caution, I would not use these airbrushes to paint airbrush ready acrylic paint. Okay, first of all, don't use anything other than acrylic in these brushes. In fact, you can't really get anything other than acrylic hobby paints nowadays because of the contaminant, the volatile organic compounds that used to be in solvent-based paints. These are ideal for spraying things consistency of ink, not paint. And they're perfect for that, and the fact that they're cordless and USB chargeable makes it great, and they'll run for about an hour on a charge. So you can work on an area and spray these subtle applications of tone and very gradually build up layers of tone, and it works really well. I'm really very happy with the results I got with them, and you can judge for yourself what it looks like. These airbrushes work really fine. In fact, I'm talking to the manufacturer, and they've got me testing some new models of them, so it's kind of worked out well. And but this came in very handy for adding the tones to the area. However, something to caution you about, and it's not the airbrushes. When you use acrylic paints to make these dyes and tints for scenery, don't be tempted to go to Michael's and get the $2 a bottle acrylic paints. Those are fine if you're doing home crafts and that kind of stuff, painting with a brush. They're not really good for airbrushing. Some people use them, they say they like them and stuff. Got to tell you, it was a learn the hard way kind of experience for me. And you can see in this next graphic how I've got some of them that I'm mixing up using my atomic paint shaker that I talked about in the last episode. And I worked with it and got the tones I wanted. But if you notice in the next picture in my filling funnel and filter, there's a lot of gunk that comes with these things, okay? And it's because they're fine, they're perfectly fine for the arts and crafts uses they're intended for. They're not really good for airbrushing. They're not intended for it. So that was some money not best spent. I'll use them for other stuff where I'm doing brush scenery work and brush application of paints and tints, but no more airbrush. After spending a considerable amount of time cleaning out one of these airbrushes from the gunk that accumulated on all the very small, fine parts, I decided better to spend the money on good quality airbrushable paint. And so the paints that I settled on for my tints were your basic Grumbacher acrylic tube paints and artist paints. And I had a great deal of success. A Grumbacher is about $8 to $10 a tube, depending on color. And Badger airbrush paints, again, you're going to thin them, and because you are doing tints and washes. So I thinned them anywhere from a 2 to 1 to 4 to 1 ratio, and you're going to apply them very lightly, and you build it up. You don't try to get the effect on 1 or 2 passes. You do a couple passes, step back, look at it, go back and shoot another pass, and this is the way you build up. And this is the way tints and shades build up in nature. You just have to be careful about it. And these airbrushes are perfect for that. They have just the right pressure, just the right output. The spray pattern is perfect, and I'm very happy with how this worked for me. This next graphic shows how I actually tested the tints on the background to see what kind of effect I would get. I masked off some area on a low area where it's not going to be seen in the scenery, and tried playing around with the tints to see does that give me just the kind of shading I want, and how many coats, how many hits did I have to do to get that shading. And you do this kind of, it's a trial and error thing, experimenting with it. So that allowed me to put in the tints that shows the variations of sun angle and clouds and that kind of thing. And the next thing came, how am I going to do the distant trees? Well, I have the Woodland Scenics foliage, the olive green foliage, which exactly matches the color of the California black oak leaves. But the problem is that foliage is in too big a clumps to simulate distant trees. I mean, it's fine for making trees in the foreground, but I wanted very, very finely ground foam. And I was going through the kitchen the other day, and I saw our old brown coffee grinder, which we haven't used in, I don't know, 10 years. And I appropriated it as a scenery materials tool, and you'll see in this next graphic that I found that if I filled the basket in the brown grinder with Woodland Scenics foam, as you can see the Woodland Scenics and the grinder, and then let it rip for about a minute, the Woodland Scenics grinder did a great job of reducing the particle size of this foam to very small pieces. So that works great. So now I have a new tool, no cost, it was here at the house anyway, for making Woodland Scenics foam into distant clumps of foliage. And now I'll probably use that for some other techniques too. I'm very happy with it. So the question then became, how do I get this onto the backdrop to simulate the trees? And you can see in this next graphic, I got some Woodland Scenics scenery cement, great stuff. It dries completely clear with a matte finish. You can see there it's in white while it's still wet, but it dries clear. And essentially what I would do is paint with an artist paintbrush, just liberally apply the Woodland Scenics scenery cement where I wanted it, and then basically just throw this ground scenic foam at the site, and just kind of very carefully, lightly tapping in with my hands, make sure it made contact, and let it harden up for 24 hours, and come down then with my small vac and basically vacuum off and save, because it allowed me to recycle it and get extended use out of it. Don't waste it, waste not, want not. And essentially that allowed me to replicate the kind of scenery that you see here, and in the pan shots that I'll show in a minute, the kind of scenery of the trees, because these trees, again, they grow in dense stands in very hospitable areas, but they also are scattered about, as they intend to encroach in other areas. And that's what enabled me to recreate the backdrop. And the final graphic shows the final result, the first area that I completed with this. that certainly went pear-shaped on us. What happened, the end of that video file mysteriously disappeared, and since I recorded it about 10 months ago, I'm not exactly sure where it went. So anyway, they pretty much finished this episode, what I wanted to talk about, the backdrop, and the backdrop is done now, as you can see from the pan shot that I did, the video, that it looks really good. I'm really happy with it. Did some minor color adjustments after it was done as I was building foreground scenery, and we're going to devote following episodes to building all the scenery that you saw in the opening segments there of this current episode. And next episode I'm going to talk about building the landforms, and I think that's going to be the main part of that episode. And then we'll move on to other parts of scenery as we go along. I expect that probably between vegetation and landforms and rocks and all the other stuff, that we're probably going to devote 4, possibly 5 episodes to this, but there's a lot to it. As I said, I really enjoyed it. I've never developed or built scenery to this level of detail. I've used techniques that I've read about, and some things I improvised. I don't know if anybody else has done them. But as I said, I'm very, very happy with the result. It's very reminiscent of my impressions of California, my favorite place to watch my favorite railroad. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. And with that, I'm going to finish this up and get to work on the next video, which I hope maybe I'll release in the next week or 2. So it depends on how long it takes to edit it. This took a little longer to put together because it had been so long. I kind of lost track of a lot of the materials I assembled, so it took me longer to put it together. But hopefully you'll enjoy this and come back for more. Model railroading is fun.